Here in Britain, there is a novel museum based outside Newark. Aptly named the Newark Air Museum, this place is one that is full of gems and bits of interesting history, and one that is close to my heart, for many a reason. However, that is not why we are here. In this wonderful place, there be an aircraft that holds a most fascinating history. And not only that, the aircraft also has a long legacy and huge fame. The Hawker Siddeley Sea Harrier. More specifically, Harrier ZA176. Now, let's go into an oversimplified, brief background of the Harrier jump jet. It is of a Cold War design, first taking flight in the mid-1960s at the now Top Gear test track at Dunsfold. It has a single jet engine which feeds thrust to 4 nozzles that are able to rotate. This allows the aircraft to perform VSTOL, or vertical short takeoff and landing. It could be armed with a variety of bombs, missiles, rockets, and a handy 13mm cannon for the nitty-gritty close-quarter combat of aerial dogfighting. The Harrier's service is also a fairly long one. From its first flight in the 1960s, it would eventually be phased out of service in the 2010s, making way for the introduction of the F-35. Though I believe the US-built Harriers are still in service in the Marine Corps. The Harrier, in the form of the Sea Harrier, accompanied HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible during the Falklands conflict in 1982. Arguably its finest hour, its the few moment. That being said, however, I am not here to justify nor glorify war. There's no glory in the needless death of human lives and the separation and destruction of families. But we must honour and remember the past and those who came before us, and what gives us something to learn from and look up to for guidance, lest we sleepwalk down similar paths that lead us to further death and destruction. Now, let's talk about one very specific Harrier. A Sea Harrier that resides in a hangar at Newark Air Museum, Harrier ZA176. What makes Harrier ZA176 so special? Well, the first thing that caught my eye while looking at the information board was this photograph. Yes, that is a Harrier on a transport ship on a van. And that Harrier is not any old Harrier. The one in the photo is the very Sea Harrier that the board is in front of. Before we dive into the incident that makes this particular aircraft famous, let's take a little look into the life of Harrier ZA176. The following information is from Target Lock and will be linked in the description along with the other references and sources used in this video. Harrier ZA176 made its maiden flight on the 25th of November 1981 at Dunsfold and later transferred to RAF St. Athan December 16th and put in reserve. But then hostilities broke out when Argentinian forces landed on the Falkland Islands and South Georgia. This brought our Harrier out of storage on the 6th of April 1982 and sent on its way a part of 809 Naval Air Squadron, and with the support of Victor tankers on its way to the Ascension Islands. From there, it was placed on board the Atlantic conveyor on the 6th of May to be delivered to HMS Hermes and into the hands of 800 Naval Air Squadron. On the 21st of May, our Harrier was on a patrol alongside another Sea Harrier, Harrier ZA455, around St. Carlos Water. A British Type 22 frigate, the HMS Brilliant, vectored the two Harriers towards a flight of incoming Argentinian aircraft. According to the sources I have looked at, Harrier ZA455 launched a heat-seeking Sidewinder missile that hit one of the attacking aircraft. Our Harrier did fire its 30mm cannon, though there is a reference to an Argentine aircraft being brought down by cannon fire from a Harrier that day, it is not clear from what I could find or understand whether our Harrier ZA176 was the one who brought it down, or whether it was another 800 Naval Air Squadron Harrier that did the deed. Either way, Harrier ZA176 did see combat. All this was part of the first day of the Battle of San Carlos, which would last until the 25th of May. After the Falklands conflict, Harrier ZA176 was transferred back to 809 N.A.S. on the 22nd of July and then served aboard HMS Illustrious in the South Atlantic on the 2nd of August. And then, on the 7th of June, it was involved in the incident that would make this particular Harrier famous. However, we will cover that in the next chapter. For the next few years, it will be transferred many more times, seeing service aboard HMS Ark Royal, returning to Dunsfold to be upgraded to the FA2 variant, and then serving aboard HMS Illustrious once again to take part in the Bosnian War. To note a few standout events. And then, on the 20th of September 2003, Harrier ZA176 was retired from active service and sent to Yeovilton, Somerset, albeit to be used for spare parts, until, that is, the 21st July 2004, where Harrier ZA176 was purchased by Newark Air Museum, where it still lies today. Now, let's take a look at the famous event I have been alluding to. Although I may have made the title of this chapter sound rather unfair to all parties, but I feel the title sounds rather catchy. But there is no offence intended. On the 7th of June 1983, Harrier ZA176 was on a NATO exercise off the coast of Portugal. Our Harrier, piloted by Sub-Lieutenant Ian Watson, call sign Soapy, took off from HMS Illustrious alongside another Harrier, and were tasked with locating a French aircraft carrier. As this was a NATO exercise, it had to be undertaken as if it was under real combat situation. Thus, both Harriers were under radio silence and radar turned off until they arrive at the allocated search area. However, it was on the return trip that our Harrier suffered a Navhars failure, and subsequently, and put simply, Soapy got lost. Low on fuel, Soapy caught sight of a Spanish freighter, the Aurego, and he managed to get the attention of the crew with the flyby, and, according to the Imperial War Museum, used hand signals to convey that he needed to land on their ship. The crew of the Aurego used the base plate of a telescope as a makeshift landing pad. Lieutenant Watson performed the landing and managed to get the Harrier nestled safely on the ship. That is until the Harrier started to roll back off the container it landed on. Watson attempted to retract their landing gear in a last-ditch effort to prevent the Harrier from further movement, but to no avail, only to be caught by the van, as you can see here. Yes, it's quite the interesting spectacle. Certainly something that neither the crew of the Aurego or Watson would have imagined they would be doing that day. This event is known as the Aurego Incident. After the event, an investigation board found Ian Watson at fault, although, according to the information board at Newark Air Museum, Watson had only completed 75% of the required training flying hours. Watson was subsequently grounded, at least until it was confirmed that the aircraft was at fault and not himself, and thus he was returned to a flying status, going on to have a rather successful career. As for the Aurego, the owners and the crew of the ship filed for a salvage claim and a compensation sum of £570,000, and that was in 1980s money. Well, there you have it. That was a little look into the life of a single plane. Harrier ZA176. I did a deep dive into this video and I thoroughly enjoyed researching this one, mostly because I learnt a little bit more about this Harrier. Like, I didn't know it even served in the Falklands, and now I have more of an interest in learning more about the Falklands conflict. Some of the information is also from a couple of trips I made to N.A.M Museum, where I spoke to a couple of volunteers who kindly divulged a lot of information and a nice tour of not only Harrier ZA176 but also a few more aircraft in the hangar. I also got in touch with the museum and someone got back to me, for which I am very grateful. By all means, I highly recommend visiting N.A.M Museum, especially on a Sunday, as you have a tour around and in their Vulcan by a couple of ex-Vulcan crewmen and a tour around their Shackleton. Something I plan on doing in the future, as I would like to cover the Shackleton, a plane that made me fall in love with military aviation after my very first visit to N.A.M Museum and being put on a tour inside that beautiful aircraft. If you're into your model building hobbies or reading and the like, their gift shop is full of various models to build and books to fill your head with ungodly amounts of information. I hope you have enjoyed this one, and I hope to see you in the next one. Thank you